Hi. So in this Startup Sessions podcast, I'd like to talk to you about startup culture, the 5 do's, don'ts, and some heuristics that are really useful for startup founders, and especially for people who are in leadership positions in startups or generally scale-ups that have grown to 30 or 50 plus in terms of their number of people working. So the first thing to understand is essentially a company, any business that tries to create value has 2 tools in its arsenal, and one of them is the cheap intelligence, which I call the type 1 intelligence, aka the machine intelligence, and type 2 is the good one, aka the human brain. And I know this is an oversimplification, but just bear with me. So essentially any company that uses any type of automation, from email marketing to internet adverts, cost per click advertisement schemes, all that, or uses any SaaS service to manage their HR, finances, all that, they're essentially using machine intelligence. That type of intelligence is very good in repeating tasks, but it's not as good in problem solving, innovating, finding novel ways to look at problems and come up with essentially unique solutions that turn into business ideas and then to products, and that creates value for the users and the customers. So for a business to be able to successful, the founders and the business itself needs to manage these 2 types of independent intelligence together in harmony. So managing the first one, the cheap type of intelligence, is not easy, but it is easier compared to managing the people complexity of building a startup. And there's a very simple reason for that. The machine type of intelligence and using the right systems, right software, right solutions to be of benefit to customers can be a very complicated manner, but if you persevere with it, if you go into the details, it is possible to learn and it is possible to master. It is complicated, but it is not entirely complex. On the other hand, making the people work well is a harder task, and the reason for that is people need to be well fed, well rested, free of pain, and not only that, but the prefrontal cortex, the decision-making part of the brain, needs to be in a healthy state. The emotional and the limbic layers of the brain need to be sorted out. What this means is, for somebody, for you, for me to be able to function well in a job, I need to feel secure, that I belong, that I have a level of autonomy in the job, that I'm building the right skills, and even the sense of meaning that people look for in their jobs. And when all of these come together, essentially the human brain, the type 2 intelligence, works very well and is the biggest competitive advantage a company can essentially have. So that is why it is important to manage the both type of intelligence in harmony with each other, and that is why it is really difficult to manage the people aspect of the business. So culture building can be defined as the initiative to influence the human variable in the most positive way possible, using the knowledge of human sciences, business tools, and to optimize that with a type 1 intelligence. Your company culture is how you recruit, acclimate new members, set goals, measure performance, conduct meetings, communicate important news and decisions, how you reward, solve problems, manage disagreements, and even celebrate. All of these serve towards the question of how do things work around here? What gets you in trouble in that specific culture? So company culture is the entirety of the unwritten rules that determine almost every action the individual makes and the decisions they make within a company. So that's why it is very complex, and that's why it's very important. So 5 things to do for a great startup culture. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, nowhere near that, but it is a good point to start. It's just a 101 introduction to culture, if you will. So take it with a measure of salt, and feel free to read up more on company culture building in many resources. Startups Grow with People, my last book, is an example of that, but there are other good books on that issue. So without delay, what are the 5 things to do for a great startup culture. The first is start by measuring your KCIs. KCIs are your key culture indicators. So it is the idea that you have to start with data and measure that to be able to see where you are. Some companies do not call them KCIs. It is okay. It is the essence of the thing. And what needs to happen is you need to have some matrix, some data around your company culture so that you know at what stage it is in and how you can grow that. The simplest way to do that is to have employee satisfaction surveys. It's a good place to start. The second thing you need to do for a great startup culture is use rituals. So culture essentially is a word that is in the domain of sociology, and sociology studies how rituals work in religion, in national identity, and all that. And rituals do really work. And what I mean by rituals, let me try to elaborate that, is clearly defined set of actions that represent a meaning and that are repeated. Examples: having AMAs, Ask Me Anything sessions with founders every Friday afternoon, no matter what. Having all hands-on team meetings at certain dates. Having introductory drinks with the oldest and most tenured people in the organization, with those who are just starting up. And many examples can be added. Third one, use stories. Humans are meaning-seeking creatures. We usually write our own stories, but nothing brings people together like shared stories. So the understanding of stories is very emotional. It's not just logical. That's why it makes a real effect, and that's why they are remembered. So have your stories, curate your stories, and tell your stories. How the story of how you came to build that company, the story of how you pivoted, the story of the problems that you had and how you solved them. 4, run transparent experiments. So startups are less like games of chance. From the point that Eric Ries wrote, ironically, The Lean Startup, and they're more like science experiments nowadays. So run the experiments transparently. So if you get a positive result, then you have a very clear proof that your tactic or whatever you are trying to do works, and it will empower and motivate the other people in the organization to join to that cause. And if the results are not really good, if the experiment failed, then you don't need to push people to do it, and you don't need to do it yourself because obviously it doesn't work. So a certain transparency with experiments serves a lot. And the 5th one, treat humans as humans, not machines. This is pretty self-explanatory. I won't go into detail, but don't buy into the hype of competent jerks, because as someone who has worked in HR and with many organizations, I can tell you 100% that doesn't work. Even if it seems like it is working at the short term, it's going to damage the company very soon. The 5 things to know for a great startup culture. So what are these? First, people don't believe in words, but they believe in what they see happening. So what you say and what you do needs to align. If not, you're going to just lose the confidence of people in the organization. 2, in good collaborations, no party is powerless. Everybody has a certain amount of power, and remember that, acknowledge that. Even if you are the director or the founder of the company and a specialist has just started up with a very tactical, minute role, even that person has power over the organization, and you need to acknowledge that and treat them as such. The 3rd one, in startups, only people with a high tolerance for ambiguity can survive. Remember that, because if people cannot tolerate things changing quickly, that's a very clear sign that they are not fit to be in that organization. The 4th thing to know, which is very important, is essentially everything depends on the quality of decisions. In good company cultures, the people in the company work together to increase the quality of decisions rather than fight with their egos and try to be right. They are not afraid that when they say, okay, I'm convinced now, I did not think of it this way, I was wrong. If people cannot say easily that they are wrong, if they feel they're going to be judged, they're going to be evaluated as unsuccessful people in the organization, then it is difficult for them to acknowledge that. So create an atmosphere that in which people can focus on making the best quality decisions rather than trying to be personally right in every corner. The fifth thing now in a good startup culture is skill building and playing politics are usually antithetical. They are at the opposite ends of the spectrum. So when people or the type of people who tended to play politics usually think that they lack skills, or they do lack skills, and they're trying to overcompensate by making things really political. And on the other end, people who have really strong skills that are not open to interpretation and that are needed by the organization tend to stay away from playing politics because they simply don't need to, and they're already in a strong standing in the company. So acknowledge that skill building and playing politics are antithetical, and if people are playing politics, then look at what skills they might be possibly lacking and try to make up those. So things to avoid doing for a great startup culture. 1. Never ever take uncalculated risks with a hiring or partnering decision. This is the most common and most detrimental mistake I see startup founders make. The indirect effect of a hire for a company is huge because that person is going to be within the company for some time. They're going to make decisions on their own, and if you don't trust them to make their decisions on their own, then it is not always a good idea to hire really senior people. But that aside, you can never be 100% sure, but treat the recruitment and interviewing processes as the most important decisions that you're going to make in the early days of the company. Second, do not use personal or positional authority to convince people. I mean, you can do that sometimes in extreme circumstances, but I mean, if in terms of leadership skills, that has to be your final ultimatum, and try not to use that at all. What you can use, what you should use, is stay within the limits of reason. Power comes from your knowledge, acknowledge that, and try to think clearly, show the reasons, and convince people, even if you don't need to convince them. Try to convince them. If you are dealing with some people's need to feel right, rather than focus on the correct decisions, give them this feedback or part ways. Third, do not contradict your values for short-term gain. The true color of people come out under stress. When we are winning, when it is that high sense of self-accomplishment and happiness, everybody is kind to each other, they are easy to work with. But it is the tough days, it is the tough weeks and tough months that really sort out how people interact with each other. Even when things get tough, do not contradict your values, and that's going to be the most important differentiator of the values and the inherent culture of that company. The fourth one, don't contradict what you say with your actions. If you do, make it a personal rule to explain to the people in the organization why you behaved the way you did. Be open to being challenged. And the fifth, do not be unfair to people. This is the most important. People have an innate sense of fairness and justice. When that boundary is breached, everyone starts to question their own existence within that organization. Do not screw people over. Even be open to helping them with their transition out of the company when you need to, but be fair all the time. In great company cultures, people who've left the company usually feel like alumni from a great college, or rather than ex-employees. So it is okay to part ways as long as you treat people fairly. So to sum up, finding the product market fit might be the ignition spark to build a startup, but if you want to keep the fire going, you have to build a system where intelligence can be converted into value as products or services to your users. There are two aspects to that, and the most complex aspect of that system is building the culture, as it determines how you will utilize type 2 intelligence. Technology is getting more and more complex, and with the way the world is heading, culture might just be the most important competitive edge startups gonna have if they want to hire and retain the top talent and organize them in a way that they're gonna innovate, solve problems, create value for their customers and users. So there are tens of other important topics pertaining to culture and people dimensions of a startup not mentioned here, but I think this is a good place to start for those who have not thought about company culture in a deliberate way before. This should be a sign to focus on that, and if you do know, I hope you've gained some insight into that. And that's it for today. Oh, and one last thing before you go, cultureboom.co is the project we are building. Feel free to browse the website, give any feedback, and consider if that's something that can provide value to your organization. And if so, feel free to get in touch.